Hello and welcome to this Sports Biomechanics demonstration. My name's Chelsea and I'm one of the senior lecturers in the Sport and Exercise Sciences department. So within this session, I'm hoping to give you a bit more insight into what sports biomechanics is, what it involves. And I'm going to do that through showing you some of our equipment and software programs that we use within our undergraduate degree program. And I'm also going to show you some research examples as well. And we'll have a quick look at some biomechanical data at the end. So sports biomechanics is the study and analysis of human movement patterns in sport. So naturally, we use quite a bit of equipment and technology to help us measure and quantify sport-specific actions. So I'm going to talk about two key pieces of kit we use within sports biomechanics. And that's our 3D motion capture system and our force platforms. So on the screen here, hopefully you can see each individual 3D motion capture camera dotted around the top of the room. These cameras have allowed us to, it gives us a reconstruction of our biomechanics lab and the reflective markers that are in it. So essentially this is a 3D reconstruction of our biomechanics lab at the university. So briefly, the cameras work by emitting infrared light into the room, and this light will reflect off reflective markers which have been placed often on specific anatomical positions on our participant. So that light then reflects back into the camera, and so the camera can see or identify at least the 2D coordinates of each individual marker in the space. So when we look at the field of view of our cameras individually, this is what they'll see. They'll see a series of reflections from markers we've placed in the space. The key thing with 3D motion capture is that these cameras are synchronized. So what the software program does is it collates these 2D images, and through the help of calibration, it gives us this 3D reconstruction of the space, but more importantly, of the participant that we're measuring. So if we just zoom in here, what you'll see is a series of green dots, and essentially this represents where a reflective marker is in 3D space. And I've used a trunk and lower limb model on the participant here. So hopefully you can make out that we have a torso, a pelvis, 2 thighs, 2 shanks, and 2 feet segments. So from tracking our different segments on our participant, this gives us really in-depth data on the mechanics of the body during a sport-specific action. So we can look at the different angles the joints are going through, the different angular velocities, but also the rotational forces acting on each joint. The reasons for looking for this, 2 key applications really. The first one is to enhance performance. So for example, we might be working with a football player who's trying to optimize ball velocity during an in-step football kick. Okay, so we can look at how the movement of their segments relate to increasing ball velocity. The second thing we can look at, and this is something I'm looking at in my own research, is understanding the mechanisms associated with injury risk. So we can look at specific movement patterns, how they increase loading on different joint structures, but also how they are associated with specific injuries as well. So those are kind of the 2 key applications that we see in biomechanics, and that's what we look at on our degree program. And the other piece of kit, hopefully you can see under the participant, is this grey rectangle, which represents the position of one of our force platforms. So that allows us to measure ground reaction force in all 3 directions. So we get a measure of vertical ground reaction force, so that's sort of acting up and down through the body. Anterior posterior force, so that's sort of forward and backward force, and also medial lateral force as well. So again, we can look at how those forces are associated with potentially performance. So it might be how we optimize takeoff force to increase jump height, or how they might be associated with injury risk during landing, for example. Okay, so that's a bit of an overview of biomechanics and some of the equipment that we might look at. Next up, I want to show you a specific sport example that we might track in this software. Okay, so here you can see an example of a side cutting maneuver. So if I just play through this, hopefully you can see that the athlete is running towards the force platform, placing their right foot on the force platform, and then changing direction by 45 degrees. So the reason why I'm looking at this action is I'm interested in the mechanisms associated with anterior cruciate ligament injury. So that's a key structure within your knee joint. And ACL injuries are quite high in team sports, so particularly things like football and netball. The reason they're higher in team sports is because athletes perform a lot of single leg landing, deceleration, and side cutting maneuvers. And these place quite a lot of stress on the body and particularly on our structures like the ACL itself. So because a lot of ACL injuries occur during a side cutting maneuver, often research will quantify an athlete's risk of this injury using a side cutting maneuver incorporating 3D motion capture. So again, during this action, we can track it and we can measure those angles, those forces in 3 dimensions. So that's the key thing with 3D motion capture. We can look at flexion extension actions, abduction adduction angle actions, so that's when it comes out to the side, but also rotation actions as well, and that's very difficult to quantify using only 2D motion capture. Hopefully you can also see here as well, when the athlete places their foot on the force platform, you can see a large red arrow that appears. So that's their ground reaction force vector. So the size of that arrow gives us an idea of the magnitude of the force placed on the body. Now, during normal walking actions, ground reaction force is around 1 to 1.2 multiples of your body weight. But when we're doing faster running actions, but also side cuts, ground reaction force acting on the body can be up to 8 times your body weight. So it's quite a lot of force acting on the joints. So having good technique, having good mechanics is really important to reduce our injury risk. Okay, so now we have tracked a specific movement. The next thing we want to do is to reconstruct the skeletal system of our participant, or get a reconstruction of the skeleton. So to do that, we will just use another software program. So I'll just bring this up here now. So the software program we were in before is called Qualisys Track Manager, or QTM, and the one I'm in at the moment is called Visual 3D. So the first thing we want to do is we want to build our model. We want to model our participant. So hopefully you can see here, from a series of markers placed all over the body, through calibration, we can build a skeletal representation of their body. So again, this is using the same example where I've built a torso, pelvis, thigh, shank, and feet segments for my participant. The next thing we want to do is apply that model to a sport-specific action that we're interested in quantifying. So in this case, I'll stick with the side cut example. So if we just play through this here, again, hopefully you can see the athlete is running towards the force platform, placing their right foot on the force platform, and then changing direction by 45 degrees. So again, it's really nice to see that visual representation of what we've quantified on the software, what we've measured. So the next key thing we're interested in as biomechanists, as sports scientists, is actually the data. So what does the data tell us about this movement pattern in relation to performance, or in this case, injury risk? Now, I've already mentioned that we're quantifying movement in all 3 planes. So the amount of data that we can get off this is a lot. So we can look at joint angles in all three planes at each individual joint. We could also look at velocities, accelerations, joint moments, which is the rotational force. Okay, so it's quite a lot of data. So I'm just going to focus on one key variable for the sakes of this demonstration. So here I've chosen to look at knee flexion angle during this action. I've chosen to look at this because it relates to my research question. We know that when athletes land in an extended knee position, it increases their risk of ACL injury. But I should say it's only one of many mechanisms associated with injury risk. There are some other mechanisms which are more related, such as knee abduction angle. Okay, so here, looking at this graph, the black line represents the mean, and this grey section represents the standard deviation of the 5 trials that I've quantified. In relation to the numbers, imagine the knee joint is fully extended. So that would be an angle of 0 degrees. And then as we start to increase in flexion, the angle will increase. Okay, so imagine 0 degrees indicates extension. And as we move up, that indicates more flexion. So we can see that when the participant initially stands on the force platform, they're in a relatively extended position. So I know that this value is around 21 degrees. In terms of the literature associated with ACL injuries, it's been suggested that athletes that land with less than 20 degrees of flexion might be at more risk of an injury. So that's one thing we could look at. We could look at the angle at initial contact. Another thing we might be interested in is how much they actively flex upon landing. And we know this is associated with ground reaction forces. The more we flex, the more we can reduce that peak ground reaction force. So to do that, I might just take the peak knee flexion angle during the impact phase and then minus that from that initial knee flexion angle to get an idea of how much they actively flex. So again, this is just one example of the data we can get off this software. Usually we will have sheets and sheets of different graphs looking at different biomechanical data. In terms of other applications, I know a lot of our current third year undergraduate students have looked at things like netball landings, netball passing, golf swings, different types of rugby kicks, and also the in-step football kick. Okay, so in terms of the applications, we can look at many different sporting actions, and again, the key implications being largely related to either performance or reducing an athlete's injury risk. Okay, I think I'm going to bring my talk to a close there now. Hope that you've enjoyed the session and you've got something from it. Hopefully you know a little bit more about biomechanics and what to expect on our degree programme. So the software programmes that I've shown you today, our undergraduate students will use largely in their second and third year. In first year, we focus more on 2D motion capture before we move on to 3D. But the students themselves will get hands-on in terms of data collection, but also data analysis using the software. Okay, I'll leave the session there. Thank you very much. And if anyone has any other comments or questions, please feel free to join us on the chat, which is available on the University of Chester website. Thank you.